Okay, so everyone, we are moving on to chapter 14. This is the last chapter at this point in time in our C Sharp book. And I always like to start with why. Why is this an important chapter? And it's hard to say that, this is one of the most important chapters because there are some pretty, critical, fundamental, you have to understand it by the time, you're done with this course, or especially by the time you graduate. There's some really critical chapters up until this point, like try to be a programmer without understanding a for loop. It's like, good luck, you're never going to get a job, you know. But file IO, writing and reading data. I mean, on the surface, it seems like a pretty simple concept. Just doing reading and writing operations. Um, but it's so critical to everything that we do is working with the data. Everything that we do, working with the data. And up until this point, we've been working with data in variables. And there's different types of variables, local variables and private variables and parameters, and we give all these different types of constants and read-only fields and all these types of variables. But at the end of the day, we're working with data. But at the end of the day, up until this point, all of our data, when you close the program, is gone. It's vanished. You're not going to use that data ever again. Well, that's why this chapter is so critical. This chapter is the chapter that says, you know what? This data is useful data, and we can save it somewhere so that when you need it later on, you can access it. Okay? So why is this chapter important? Because writing data to a file or to a database and reading data from somewhere, okay, writing the data somewhere and then later on reading it somewhere is extremely critical to everything that we do on a normal basis. You have to be able to store data and retrieve data from your programs. And so, this is one of the most important chapters, although it is just an introductory chapter. Okay. In the history of computers, you go back 20 years ago, okay, all the computers did was write to local files on your hard drive. Okay. And that's essentially what we're doing in this chapter. Now, a long time ago, they said, you know what, that's probably not the best way to save our data. There has to be a better way. And that's when databases came around. And that's why there's a 40-day class in this curriculum dealing with databases, making sure that not only you guys understand databases, but you know how to have applications that write to those databases and read from those databases and update data and delete data and all those kinds of operations. Okay, but this is the introduction to that. Okay, so although what we're doing in when you think of it from a historical perspective, what we're doing is way outdated in this chapter. Okay, these fundamentals are critical for what we do on a daily basis. Instead of interacting with local files, we interact with databases. And the truth is, there's a lot of crossover skills. A lot of the theory that we learn here applies to databases. And so those crossover skills are very valuable. So really important chapter. And, today we're just focusing on three different things. The first being a little bit of theory in this chapter because, working with files, it's just terms, really. Just the terminology, the language that's used in the industry. What are the important terms to understand? So when I say, a field, you know what it is. Or when I say a record, you know what that is, uh, and so forth. So there's just some terms that are important to be familiar with. Then after that, We're going to work with a couple of new classes. There's a class called File and there's a class called Directory. Um, that's that's your introduction to working with files on your hard drive and directories on your hard drive, again on your local hard drive. And then at the end, I'm just going to do a simple demo of, okay, let's just take some data and write it into a file. Then let's just open it up and demonstrate that that data is on the file. And then let's write a program that can read that file. So we're just going to do like file input and file output. A real simple demonstration. And then tomorrow in our next video, we'll take it up a notch. We'll take it up from the basics into some things that are a little bit more complex. So the theory, I said there's just some important terms. When you're working with, first off, we're working with local files, and local files are that of those files on your hard drive. Well, when you're working with local files, in the old days we would call them flat files. And that's just a term. That's just a term for a file that's on your hard drive. And when you open a file, in the old days, it was pretty common to have a piece of data, like someone's name, right? Like Cameron, right? But then you might have Cameron's age follow his name. Cameron's, let's just say he's 19 and male, right? So you would have this grouping of data that you would store in a flat file, and you would separate these values with something, typically a comma or a semicolon. Those were the kind of the two characters that were common to separate the individual pieces of data. And thus they created files called CSV. If you've ever seen a file with a CSV extension, I think probably most of you have at this point. That's a comma separated values, CSVs. These commas also have another term that they are given in computer science. Are called delimiters, and delimiters are just whatever symbol that separates the data. Then that's one grouping of data about Cameron. But we have more than one student in this classroom, and so we could store Danny. We'll just say Danny's 20 and he's also male. Okay, so when you start storing multiple rows, I guess the first term that is worth looking at here is a field. Okay, so what is a field? Well, a field is any one piece of information. All of these are fields. So in an Excel spreadsheet, an individual cell, that's your field. Okay, when you have an entire row of data, so a field is an individual piece of data. However, when you have a row of data, well, another term for that we use is a record, right? So you put a bunch of fields together, you put 3, 4, 5 fields together, separated by whatever the delimiter is, and you have a record, okay? And like I was saying earlier, this terminology is the same in databases, right? So we use records and we call them fields, and it's just a little bit of terminology. Nothing too hard to understand, just probably new to a lot of you. Just new terminology. Now, most files have a way of making sure that every record is unique. Okay, so right now we're just going by people's first names and their age and their gender, but it's very possible that we could have another Danny in the class who's also 20 and is a male. So if that's the case, we have two records that look identical, even though they represent different people. And so another important term that we use when we're working with files is a key field. Okay, and a key field is a piece of data. It's a field that is its primary objective is to make sure that each record is unique. Okay, and a lot of times those key fields are, in our situation, you might think, okay, we're talking about people here, and what's a unique indicator for each person? Like, what's a unique piece of data about each individual person?
Birthday.
Well, you could have a Danny with the same birthday. Huh? Social, right? Social would be DNA. That'd be pretty hard to, but that's another good one. But that'd be a little bit harder than social. But Social Security. So you could put a Social Security number down for the key field, and then, everyone's record would be unique. However, another common thing, social isn't something exactly safe and secure that you just want to go storing in a flat file. So another common technique is just make an auto incrementing number. The first row would be row 1, the second row would be row 2, and so on and so forth, 3, 4, 5, and incrementing up. So key fields fairly commonly are just auto incrementing numbers. Okay, so we have fields, we have records, we have delimiters, and we have what a key field is. Other than that, that's most of the terminology that we're going to use. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and this is just something else that when I think of file I/O, file input and output, there's one other thing that always just jumps into my head right away, and that's because whether you're working with files or you're working with databases, there's 3 steps that need to take place every single time, okay, for it to work correctly, okay? And that is you open a file, you read or write to the file, then you close the file. And so those are kind of the 3 steps that, regardless of working with files or databases, if we're working with databases, you could say open a connection, read or write from the database, close the connection. And so those are just kind of 3 important steps that they're talked about early on in the chapter. And I just want to point those out. That's something that just sticks in my mind as important steps for it to work correctly. And when we do this, when we get to this portion here, when we actually read and write to a file, I will show you what is it that opens a file, what is the line of code that reads or writes to the file, and what is the line of code that closes the file. Okay, so there's your basic terms. If we get into oh, you know what? I got a few more terms. No, I don't. I'm going to skip the terminology. We're just going to try and write some code now. I'm not going to define every term in the book for you. That's in there. You can read. The other stuff is a little bit more common sense to computers. If you've worked on a computer, you passed an operating system class, I expect you to know what a file is. I expect you to know what a directory is. Bytes and megabytes, I expect you to know what that is. You can read about RAM and volatile memory. And then I guess the only last thing I will say, there are two types of files that you can work with. There are text files and binary files. Okay, now text files are meant for human eyes. Binary files are meant for reading by computers. Okay, and I could say are meant for human eyes to read, right? So you can work with, in this class, you'll be able to save your files in two different ways. One in English text, okay, and one in ones and zeros or binary. Now, if you save a file in ones and zeros in a binary, the whole purpose of that is to be a more efficient file. Like if you have a program that needs to save all of its data and then load that data into another program, it makes sense to just keep it in a low-level format like binary files. It's a more efficient way of sending data from point A to point B if you just keep it in binary. That way you don't have to convert from binary up into ASCII or Unicode. So it's more efficient for computers to just send data back and forth with binary. That's the purpose. However, if a human set of eyes ever needs to open the file and read it, that's when you need to store it in a normal .txt text file. Okay. Moving on, we're going to write some code. The first couple of classes are mainly meant. This is not, when we're working with these classes, the main function is to determine file information and directory information. Like, does a file exist in a certain directory? You know, list the files in a directory. So this is, if I had off the top of my head, these classes mainly are informative. Okay, that's kind of their main purpose, just to inform you about the directory structure. It's almost like opening up. It's almost like opening up your File Explorer, right? It's almost like opening up your File Explorer and saying, okay, well, what pictures do I have on here? Or what music do I have on here? And what documents? Okay, now I see I've got this GitHub folder, and when's the last time I interacted with that folder? Okay, 10/23/2015. Like, okay, so that's some information that might be relevant to you. But this is just, this is not actually creating files. This is not going to be the technique that we use to actually write data to files or read data to files. This is just in getting us to the point where we're working with files and mainly displaying information and being informative. Just to have some files, I've got these random files here. Let's not include my budget or this giant ISO image. I'm just going to copy these files just to have some random files and so that we can work with. And I'm going to paste them. I got to look at my file path. I believe it's x86. No. I think it's here. I'm drawing a blank right now. Documents. There we go. Visual Studio. Projects. chapter 14, lecture. Here's my application 1. And I'm going to paste these right here. Now, it's been a while since I've done this. Let's see. Oh, I don't have one of those files available to me. So I'm going to open another one up. I don't have that document. I'm just going to grab these 3 files. Okay, I'm going to paste them here. Matter of fact, I think that's not the correct directory for them. I think they're going to have to go in bin. I think this is the correct directory. So what's nice about the file class and the directory classes is that most of their methods are static, meaning you can call them by their class name dot method name. And so I'm just going to start with something real basic, since we know this is a text document named review questions, and it's not displaying the file extension. Let me see if I can change that real quick. Let's see. File name extensions. There we go. So we've got review questions .doc. And so that's going to be the file I'm going to try and interact with. So I'm going to say if file. Now notice right away the first thing, I try to use the file dot, and file is not recognized as a class. So I need to add a using statement using system.io. So if you're going to use these classes, first step, import or have a using statement for the IO namespace so we have access to those classes. And we're going to say if the file exists, then we're going to do something. Else, we're going to say file doesn't exist. And the file that we're checking on, we said, is review questions.doc. I'm just going to copy so there's no typos. Paste it in there. Okay, so exists is a method that returns true or false. It belongs to the file class, and if it exists, we're going to do a write console. And we're going to write a few bits of information about it, which we can say the file was created on, and again we're going to use the file dot, and you can see all of the methods that you have available to you in the file class. We're only going to use a few of them in here. One of them is get creation time, and then pass it the string. You can see that it's a string path, so you can provide directory information. Now I copied the file into the directory, so I believe, oops, I believe I don't need to provide a path because I believe it's in the actual correct directory. Okay, so when was the file created? When was it last accessed? The file was accessed last on, and the method we're going to use is file dot get last access time. So when was it created? The last time someone accessed it. And the last one, we'll see the last time someone wrote to the file. The file was last written to on which is get last write time. Okay, now I think I have my files in the right directory. If not, I can move them around. It's a good thing for you guys to see anyways, so that you guys don't struggle with this being, okay, is it in the bin directory? You know, what's the root? Is it in debug? You know, is it in the root of the folder here? Is it in the root of the solution? Where do you actually need to put your files to be in the correct root directory? And like I said, I believe it's in the bin right here. I could be wrong. We're about to find out. So we're going to see if the file exists, review questions.doc. Let's try it out. Okay, and right away it says the file doesn't exist. Okay, so let's move them. Let's cut and go up a directory, paste them right here. Okay, let me pause it real quick. We'll come right back and we'll find the right directory. Of course, as soon as I pause the recording, I move them into the correct directory. We have to go, okay, so here's my projects. Here's my solution folder. Here is one of my projects. I didn't change the name. As you can see, it's just called Council Application 1. I should have changed the name to something. It's not in the root of there. It's inside of bin, and then it's inside of debug. This is the root directory for this particular project, right? Because everything's running out of here. Matter of fact, and I don't know if you guys have known this up until this point, if you go down here, you want the executable, like if you ever want to deploy one of your programs, there's your executable right here, right? Your .exe, run the program, and it just, because I don't have a breakpoint in there, a read line, it doesn't stay, but I can start without debugging now, and now you can see the file exists. When was the file created on? The last time it was accessed, and somehow it's got this, that doesn't even make sense, but that's the data that it has stored about itself, so I can't change that. But that's working with the file class. Well then, it's safe to say working with directory is pretty similar, right? This is just informative, right? So if I find a directory that I want to work with, maybe I want to work with the simple theme here. So I'll copy that into my documents, projects, chapter 11 lecture, nope, chapter 14 lecture, here, debug, and paste. So I've got a simple hyphen theme directory or folder. And we can write, now we can work with the directory class to interact with that. So this one will be a little bit different. I'll have a directory name stored in a string. I'll have an array for all the files that are going to be in that directory. I'll say if the directory exists, and in here is the name of our directory, which our case was simple theme. The directory exists, and it contains the following files. And then what I could do, because the directory class has a method that returns all of the files in it, and it returns it in an array, I could have a list of files equals directory dot get files inside of simple theme. And then I'll just have a for each var item in list of files console write line your item. So inside of here, inside of simple theme, these are our files, right? So there's a bunch of PHP files and HTML, a style.css. And so what this does is it sees if the directory exists, then we load up all the files into an array, a string array, and then we loop through each one of those files and write them to the screen. Else, directory does not exist. And I know at this point this isn't the most exciting, oh my gosh, look at what we're doing. This is just displaying information, and I get it, that's kind of boring. But knowing that these classes exist, and these classes are referred to as utility classes, right? They're just there for you to use and access should you need them. Okay, so let's take a look at our program now. Okay, and of course this is all from the file right here, and then this is where the directory code. It says the directory exists and it contains the following files, and you can see it includes the directory name / file name. And there are a bunch of other methods that that are available to you. These are just two simple demonstrations of some of the methods that they have. But if you're curious about what are all the methods, well, code it up yourself and mess with the directory class. Put a dot, and then here you could see all of the different methods. If you want an explanation, you can just get the tooltip there. Okay, or the book has a summary of all the methods that it believes is that the book believes is useful. Okay, so I'm gonna pause the video here. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do today was a basic reading and writing to a file. Now these will get more complex, but you got to start from somewhere, and I realize a lot of people haven't done this before, so we're starting with the most basic of reading and writing. Now there's some theory here that I'm not going to cover today. I'll cover it tomorrow, because I'm skipping over the theory of dealing with strings. Okay, and we'll come back to this tomorrow in tomorrow's video, but since this one's getting a little longer, I want to wrap it up here and just do the code. So the first thing we're going to do is write to a file. And the file that we're writing to is names.txt. And we'll talk about these different file modes tomorrow a little bit, but the file mode is going to be create. And we're going to set the file access to write. I'll put a little line break in there. And there's actually two classes that we work with here, the file stream class and the stream writer class. And this will be new to most of you. Where we create an instance of a class, we call it file. And we use that instance in the constructor of another instantiated class. Okay, so you can see we pass the file into this other instantiation here, StreamWriter. So we essentially have two classes that are working together to get the job done of writing to a file. And then I'll just have an array of strings. And I'm just going to put 5 names, right? So I'm going to pick on Joe, Danny, Dave, throw my name in there, and Mike. Okay, so we have a string of names, and this is going to be the data that we write to the file. So pretty straightforward. I'll write a standard for loop, I equal to 0, I less than names dot length, increment I. Not sure what that is. We're going to call our stream writer, and then we can use a write line. We've got the same methods, just as a console.writeLine. So we've got writer.write and writer.writeLine. Names sub I. Okay, so I said earlier, there's 3 things that we do. We open a file, which is done right here. You read or write to the file, which is done right here. And now we have to close the file, which is essentially closing our 2 objects, which is the file and the writer string. So we'll say writer.close and file.close. Okay, now if this works, we should have a new text file in our root directory. And once this is done, just to the console, I'm just going to put a file saved message. That way you know something actually happened. And really it's all the same output as before, but now it also says file saved. If I then go into my directory, and I don't even need to refresh, there's the names.txt. If I open up names.txt, you can see the data has been written to the file. Okay, so that's the process of writing data to a file. So just add that note in there. And then if we're going to read that data out of it, those were the 2 classes that we did use to write. Now we will read data from a file. By the way, when we say writing data to a file, that's also known as data input. Writing data into the file, and then reading data from a file obviously is data output. You're reading it from the file, and then you got to do something with it. What we're going to do probably, we'll just put it in a variable, and then we'll display that variable to the console. And so file stream file equals new file stream. Now you can see up as before, we're working with the same class, file stream. And instead of stream writer, we're going to have a stream reader. So let's put this in quotes, names.txt. This time we're doing a file mode.open. And we need to have a file access of read. Now we're getting an error here because we already have a variable name that, so we'll just call that file2. Stream reader. Similar process as before, except for a different class. We're going to pass it file2. Displaying all names from the file. While the first thing we need to do is we need to read one line from the file. So we'll have a string name equals reader.readLine. So very similar to before. Open the file. This particular line here reads data from the file, while name is not null. Go ahead and write name to the screen. And then reassign name to the next line. Reader.readLine. So this will continue to read individual lines, put them in a string, display that string to the console, and then read another line. And while that line isn't empty, it'll continue to loop. And then we close the file. So the same process, right? Open the file, read the file, close the file. And just like we did it last time, we want to close these in the right order. So we want to do a reader.close and a file2.close. Now, just a little kind of preview, I guess, of tomorrow. Since this names.txt has already been created once, and the file mode is create instead of, I don't know, maybe append, right? Since this is create, let's see what happens if we add another name to it. So we'll just add Tom to the end of our names list, and we'll see how that works. So if we debug, start without debugging, you can see it doesn't actually append the data. So we save the file again. We saved over the file. In other words, we overwrote the file. And then here we're reading names from the file. And you can see it includes our new name of Tom. It didn't append anything. It just overwrote it. due to our file modes. Okay, so that's our basic, our 101, our basics of working with files, working with the file class, working with the directory class, writing data to a file, and reading data to a file. Okay, and that's all for this first video. Tomorrow we'll come back with more.